Hi, loves. Today we have a sensitive topic that may require some viewer and listener discretion. We will be speaking with a survivor and advocate for eating disorder awareness. I want to assure you that I will be mindful of our audience and want you to know that we will not be discussing any numbers, body sizes, or share any before or after images. The goal of today's episode is to shed light on this issue and to provide insight to those affected, as well as support for those standing with loved ones currently in similar situations. At the end of this episode, we'll share a page of resources for more useful information. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to listen to this important subject that's not discussed nearly enough. Today we have a very special guest, and our topic is actually going to be a little bit sensitive, so keep that in mind. We will be discussing today the topic of eating disorders and moving through them successfully. And I want to welcome our wonderful guest today. Her name is Robin, and I have known Robin now for going on 12, almost 13 years. And we'll be discussing some of the things that she and her family endured. Robin is a painter or an artist, and she is a mom of two and a survivor. So I am so happy to have you here today. Robin, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
How about we tell our viewers a little bit about yourself? Like what is a day in the life of Robin? What are you into? Things like that.
I enjoy painting. I use that as a way to express my feelings. Sometimes those feelings that get stuck inside. So that's the majority of my time, hopefully, is spent being creative. But I am still a mom of teens and one in college. So I'm busy with mom jobs on the regular and being a wife and being a dog owner, all those things. So a regular day of a midlife woman who's home. The typical things that come up with that are usually what I'm doing.
Okay. How would you say that you became aware that there was even an issue with your eating disorder, or that there was a possibility of having an eating disorder?
My daughter came to me at the age of 14 after struggling several months with not eating and trying to lose weight. Believe it or not, it's hard to notice, even though it was under my roof. By the time she came to me, she was so sick. She was admitted to the hospital. So to answer the question, I attribute my journey from her discovery. But we got through hers first, and then I started mine. But through her illness and time getting better, I was introduced to many concepts that then made me realize I had the same problem. It was expressed a little differently. Being older meant it came out a little bit different, but for the most part, I was exhibiting a lot of the same thought process and behavior.
I see.
So that's how I found out, but it wasn't for a year until she was into her recovery process.
So you didn't have any, how long have you, your personal experience, have you been dealing with an eating disorder?
Looking back, once I connected some dots, I began to look at behaviors as a teen, starting at 16.
Okay.
Excessive weightlifting and being active beyond normal activity for someone my age, running miles and miles and miles, or weightlifting and being interested in foods. When I look back at that and I look back at those behaviors, they were clearly disordered then. And then as life happened and as I went through high school, and that was a horrible experience, it really wasn't that great. And then into college and the stressors with that is when it grew and became a real problem.
I see.
So that's when I became, I think, in the disorder. And that episode lasted a good 10 years.
Wow.
So I've been dealing with it for 35 plus years. Yeah.
And what prompted you to get help then was realizing that your daughter was now dealing with the same thing. And how did it, if you don't mind my asking, how did it even arise that your daughter was battling this?
That's an interesting and very good and poignant question, because that is where the crux of a lot of miscommunication and the inability to catch this with young adolescents, boys and girls alike, all genders. This seems to be a problem right around 13 when bodies are changing naturally. And the comparison game today with social media, unlike what I had as a young person with just being able to grab a magazine and making that choice, it's in their face. So I think younger and younger now we are seeing eating disorders develop at as low as age 8. Wow. But for my daughter, it was 14. She was a thespian, so she was in plays, and the director kept saying, "You're too big." The word "big" was used to describe tall, and I think that set a seed in her brain that she was taking up too much space. She needed to be smaller, and therefore if she lost weight, she would maybe fit into what they were looking for into these plays. Right. So that's kind of how it began. Using social media, she wasn't giant on social media channels, but it's available, and it was there on how to lose weight. There's plenty of resources, so knowing that information was out there, she took some of that to heart, and while she was away on her 8th grade trip to DC, she came back, and it was not until then that I noticed she had lost a considerable amount of weight, but still it was not registering because she was also developing as a woman. She had started that part of her life, so I thought it was part of growing tall and losing weight and
the body
developing.
Changing.
Right, so it's very unnoticeable, but through her coming to me and being so frightened and scared, she thought that she didn't know what to call it. She actually came to me one night crying and said, "I think I have this thing called an eating disorder." So she had done some research because her friends pressured her into it and said, "If you don't tell your mom, we're going to tell your mom." Apparently, that's what happened. So she came to me, was brave enough to discuss this with me, and it was the next day we went to see a specialist, and it was then she was admitted into the hospital. That's how far along it had already gotten under my nose.
Wow.
Which sounds like I'm a bad mom or something,
No,
but it's amazing how it's undetectable.
Right. And you and I had talked about it a little bit yesterday, or not yesterday, the day before, but when I had mentioned to you that I also had a friend who had an eating disorder. Unfortunately, she did not survive. And when I thought about it back then, this was several years ago, but I was like, how does one get so sick from an eating disorder? Can't they just eat something? And it didn't process to me in my mind, but what exactly does it mean when someone is sick from an eating disorder? Because isn't it just a matter of feeding them? Or
it's a very good question, and it's a giant universal misconception. Yes, and I'm glad you bring that up because I didn't even know what eating disorders were as the mom. So there is not a lot of education out there or information, nor is it being discussed as a normal thing like drugs and alcohol in school. It's not considered a subject. So we are all undereducated to begin with. But mainly being sick in an eating disorder means a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but it takes a toll on the organs inside. Typically, number one affects the heart. So there's cardiac problems, bradycardia, which is the slowing of the heart rate, hypotension, which is the slowing and lower blood pressures, and arrhythmias that are speeding up of the heart. It's in a panic mode, for example. So these types of things begin to happen because a heart is a muscle. And when you start starving your body, you are starving organs as well. Levels of potassium and different types of enzymes are completely out of whack, which then put organs out of whack. And then the heart is really solely responsible for keeping the body alive. And when that starts to get too tired, then we start seeing death in that situation. So it's more about not what they look like, but what's going on inside the body. Because eating disorders can look very different. You have atypical anorexia, for example, which means they don't fit the Hollywood version of what we think anorexia is, which is a way of looking. Typically you could see bones or whatever, but Atypical is you don't meet the characteristics of that definition, but you are still suffering and as ill as someone in that position.
Okay.
To the extreme of the other side of being in a larger body size and having the same problems. So it's a spectrum of disorders inside one label, and they all tend to affect the inside more than anything else.
I see.
Yeah.
When you were in the hospital, not you, but when your daughter was in the hospital and you were realizing, wait a minute, I'm experiencing a lot of these things. Some of these things that they're talking about in therapy, I've also experienced them too. What was that like for you to realize after all these years, I didn't even know that I could possibly also have an eating disorder?
That is huge. That was a huge moment for me, because the turning point came when I suddenly realized and felt like a giant idiot that I didn't know that I was behaving and thinking with disordered thoughts and behaviors that could even influence others in my family. I mean, at first, the sheer responsibility of feeling like you caused something, that came first. Like, I did this, and the guilt of that. Well knowing that it was, a lot of this is hereditary. A lot of it had nothing to do with the way we spoke in our home, but a lot of it is invisibly broadcasted. And that was I think a lot of my behaviors and thinking. So there was this realization of, oh my God, how dumb can I be? So then I first felt like an idiot. Then I started to feel like mad. Like, how could this happen? Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't anyone pick it up? I've had so many health problems up until that point that would indicate it, and it was missed and missed and missed and missed by GI docs and cardiac physicians and kidney people. I mean, you name it. I went to everyone. I was having a lot of problems, and it all got missed. So I was angry. I was angry not only for myself, but really angry that it was happening to my daughter and that I had a part in it. We learned through therapy that we can't take that on. That's not our responsibility. It's actually the child's responsibility to take on the choice to get better, and it's also their responsibility and choice to be in it. But I still felt responsible in some ways, of course. So the first feeling of being an idiot, then the feeling of being mad, and then some sort of sense of relief that, oh, this is what it is. Like, all my life trying to figure out, what am I running from? Why am I this way? Because on some instinctual level, I knew inside, even at age 12, I knew there was something there that just kept nagging at me that was different than other people. And my behaviors, I knew, were different. So there was a sense of relief with that, in a weird way.
Yeah, because now it's like, okay, well, now that I can identify it, it gives you almost like a space.
A roadmap.
Yes, exactly. Now it's like, okay, well, now I know where I am. How do I get out?
Right.
Exactly. So you mentioned earlier, like the Hollywood, what Hollywood thinks of when they think eating disorders. Personally, when I think eating disorders, I think of like bulimia or anorexia, things like that. But that's not something or is it something that people are easy to hide? What are some ways that you can, I guess, know that that's happening, or what's the word that I'm looking for?
The ability to identify it in someone?
Yeah.
It's a good question too, because there's a lot of misinformation as well as undereducation on the topic. That's a toughie. Eating disorders, not just anorexia, but eating disorders in general, are a very sneaky disease. They're a disease of perfection. I call them, they are mental illness, but they're a disease of perfection. Perfection can be perceived by everyone else as a good thing. They have good grades, they are disciplined, they this and that, fitting into categories that we consider a good student or an organized person. So there's a lot of ways it can hide.
Okay.
Identifying it the quickest way and the most, I'm not going to say easy is not the right word, but there were a couple signs when I look back that helped me recognize it was happening. After she told me, I looked back and I was like, oh, that and that and that and that. It was being isolated. That was the number one. More isolation than normal, less social activity with the family and others, a sense of the word is like, there was more irritation with everyone. My daughter seemed very indignant, I guess. So that wasn't her normal MO. She typically was a very gentle, kind person that we got along with, but I noticed there was behaviors that were typical teenage transitional attitudes. So again, it was not picked up because I was seeing normal development, characteristics of a young lady becoming a woman plus a teenage person dealing with their hormones. So all of that hides underneath there. The eating disorder can hide there very easily and it's not realize it's happening. But the isolation and the change in responses to me and the family was the number one, like being very edgy, you know, because she was hungry and she was hangry, you know, basically. Yeah. So that I would say, if anybody is looking for a way to identify this in someone, it would mainly be in looking at the changes in behavior from their norm.
I see.
That are beyond typical developmental changes at the time of the person. Now, if you're dealing with a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, that can be a little more tricky.
And when you talk about, you know, someone who is currently going through this, as a family, how does it even affect the family structure, or the way that you interact with them? And I'm sure that you noticed there were changes even in the home. Oh yes, yeah,
that's so true. Those changes came more after we were in recovery.
Okay.
Because that makes eating disorders mad and louder, and there's a lot more feelings and big things happening because now the person with the illness needs to change and cope a different way. So there's a giant transition period of resistance. Okay. Of course, you're taking away the one thing that was working to handle stress and emotion. Where do you put all that stuff now? So the family environment becomes explosive, sometimes definitely treacherous and not calm. At least it was that way in our home. The other siblings tend to be not forgotten, but there is an attention towards the person with a disability or with the mental illness or with anything, any illness. You have a shift away from everyone else. So the way it affected the family was we had to address my daughter's feelings in a way that was helpful and keeping her healthy, and I don't like to use that word, but keeping her on track with her recovery. And at the same time, pay attention to my son and make sure he's getting what he needs at such a critical time for him as a teen also.
Right.
And then the bigger relationship difficulty and complications came between my husband and I. He's working outside the home. I'm in the home, so I have more time to deal with the recovery process and taking care of my son. And getting the information, knowing the information, but then having to teach the partner. So there was an area where I have resentment and I'm trying to deal with my own stuff with that. And then once they started doing family therapy, then we all were able to come on board. But it does affect everyone. And beyond the nucleus of the family in the home, it goes to in-laws and greater than that, because now you're dealing with people having triggering conversations at dinner that are not educated on how to coach someone through just having dinner together. That becomes a difficult thing. So it goes beyond just the family members in the house, definitely.
Right. We're going to take a really quick break. When we come back, I definitely want to talk to you about your own personal experience and you going through this, even now that you are not in your teen years, having to take care of yourself and take care of someone else who is going through this. So we're going to take a really quick break and we will be right back. Welcome back. We have Robin with us today, and we've been discussing eating disorders. And I wanted to dive into this segment and talk about what it was like for you to going through your own recovery, and while still caring for your daughter, who is also in recovery.
That was a tough time because you have to compartmentalize healing journeys, and of course my priority was her because she was immensely sick, and to the point where we almost lost her a couple times. So my priorities were there, and I was focused, and I knew that everything I needed to do could be put on hold. So while I was on hold, I was very focused, and that was actually, for lack of a better word, a little easier because that's all I had to be concerned with. Once she got to a point where residential facility treatment was an option, when she transferred away from us, unfortunately, away from home, which was drastic because she was 14 and her first time away from home. Once we were able to get stable there, then I was able to pay attention to my own recovery and journey, which required some of the similar teams of people, which included a dietitian, a medical eating disorder specialist, and psychiatrist and psychologist. So we got her all set, and then I went and sought out my team, and my team got right to it. I had very little time, so I had to really get to it, and I knew I needed to get better for my daughter. And she was part of that inspiration for me to get better. But the hard part was accepting it myself and owning it and dealing with it and making a choice to change. Young adolescents have to do that in their recovery, and a lot like addiction, it's the same thing where you have to break yourself down so far and stop blaming people, where you get down to the business of figuring out you really want to get better. So it's the same for me. But at 50 something, that's a different journey because I have other balls in the air, like taking care of my family, and the fact that I was going through my own midlife changes alongside of changing not only my body but my mind. So that on top of the typical things that a woman goes through in midlife was the hardest work. That work was, in one word, just acceptance, real acceptance.
You had mentioned earlier that this is a disease of perfection, right? And I know when we had talked earlier about this, you talked about how it was more of a challenge for you because even though your daughter was going through many of the same things, or that you were going through many of the same things that she was, you almost had to keep your diagnoses, your recovery process separate from hers. So, was it due to comparison, or what was that like?
That's a good question. Protecting recovery is something you're taught in treatment, and that goes for friends talking about their own illnesses and comparing each other to protecting yourself from your own family sometimes. I needed my daughter to concentrate on her path, and I knew that disclosing my path would cause her a lot of pain. It would have been difficult for her to focus on her own recovery, knowing that I was someone in the same household going through the same thing, because there's a lot of comparison going on inside the disease itself. Typically in any therapy group or any journey with people trying to heal from something, there's always going to be a competitive nature to it. And whether or not it's really who you are, it's just there, and it happens. And knowing that, I wanted to keep it away from her. I consulted her entire team. I went through lots of channels to make sure that was the correct way to deal with it. But eventually she did discover it, and that was a tough period of time. And so I had to really learn my boundaries. So did she. And I had to continue on my path, because I was at a point, unfortunately, where the stress of helping her had also succumbed to harming me physically, and I had to take care of myself. So that switch was difficult, because you're taking away from your child, but you also know I need to take care of me to take care of them. Right. So it was really hard, really hard to protect her and protect me.
Well, she was in such a fragile, both of you being in such a fragile state. And there's one line that you had said something earlier, and it kind of has just been bouncing around in my head, and it's hard for someone who hasn't had any kind of experience with this, or who doesn't understand quite what the vast scape of this really is. You said when you're in the disorder, you're trying to be a better anorexic. Like, it's almost as if you're not only in competition with yourself, but with others. And so when you talk about your daughter having to go through her healing and you doing it in parallel, does that not, for lack of a better term, help each other as running buddies to be able to help each other go through it? Not so much.
No, not so much. There's, unfortunately, and what you're talking about is at your most ill state of mind. I think most of the clients in the residential facilities that I noticed were always in competition with each other to be the sickest, and that's part of the disease. So there is the component of comparison, and it's dangerous. So everything has to be treaded on very carefully, and that was part of the reason why I did not disclose what I was going through. For me personally, before I knew I had a problem, I was always looking to be more superior in any way that I can be, and that was part of the disease, but that's not who I am. So it was a very alter ego for me to say, I'm going to be the most badass person in this room and take more punches or take more kicks or whatever. And like, I have something I have to prove, and constantly always proving my identity. And that it was part of the competitive nature of the disease. Just you always had to be the best at what you were doing. And that included, once you're super ill and you realize it, unfortunately for a lot of these people, that included being the best at their eating disorder. And that's a tough place for therapists and healthcare providers to be, because everybody is trying to protect everyone's recovery. But it's really it's the choice and the job of the person going through it to do that for themselves. And I think at that time I knew she was very ill at that time, so I just kept it away.
One of the things you mentioned is sometimes people think of this as an adolescence disease or something that people develop in their early teens. What about people who are currently going through this in their adult ages, like as opposed to, maybe they have had it they have been experiencing it since they were since their youth, but are now learning, oh, this is what that means. Very similar to your story, how now that I know what this is, now I can fight it. So how does that journey progress? What is that like?
I think there's a lot of shame at first involved, because you feel as a woman in your midlife, you should have your crap together already, and that there's an expectation that you really know yourself. But figuring this out at that age was harder. I don't want to say harder. Going through it as an adolescent has got to be the scariest thing you've ever gone through. I think going through it as an adult, there are a lot more factors in your daily life that make it a little more complicated. So the addition of having to appear a certain way for the rest of society is a big, heavy thing that's weighing on you all the time, and fitting a mold of what you're supposed to look like and be like after having a couple kids and being where you are. All of that definitely did not help me to get better. It extended the recovery time, because I was dealing with the normal things you'd be going through at menopause or premenopause, on top of trying to get better. And getting better for me meant changing my body quite a bit. So I would say the biggest lesson out of that, going through that transition, as it would be for anyone that does not have a disease or an eating disorder, on top of already going through midlife. The biggest gift of that was really learning how to accept those changes and just roll with it. Literally just roll with it. That was a giant gift for me in the process.
I think it's beautiful that you're even using that word. It's a gift. As strange as that may sound to some, to experience such a tremendous challenge, this huge feat to have to overcome, and yet you're seeing it as a gift in your life. Why is that?
The brain space occupied with trying to be perfect, and whatever that looks like for someone is what it is. For me, it meant keeping an identity up of the person who works out the most, the person that eats the healthiest, the person that does all these things that I had a checklist of that I thought was the image I wanted to portray. With all of that gone, there was more room for me to be connecting with who I really was, and I liked that person. I just pushed that person aside, so I was able to reconnect with that person, develop that person, and then really concentrate on the things that make me me, which is my art and connecting with nature more and being present. It just gave me space to really connect and be, all the buzzwords today are, connecting and being present and true to yourself and all that stuff. And that stuff's great.
Yeah.
But I mean, to really, really understand and accept who you are for who you are and be okay with what's coming. That was the other piece of it. That was a gift. And that came with the skills I learned in getting over this.
One of the things you mentioned earlier is dealing with the shame, right? You were talking about dealing with the shame of this is something that could be seen as a shameful experience, but you're using your voice to shed light on it, to show people that this is not something that people have to go through alone, to be able to take something as horrendous that you were dealing with and transform it into something beautiful. What would you say now that you are moving into your recovery? How has that affected all aspects of your life? I know that as an artist, you said that one of the ways that you express yourself is through your art. How have you seen that change?
I would say it's given me, the first word that comes to mind is freedom. The freedom to just be. If I don't want to go walk the dog that day, I will find another way to entertain the dog because I'm too tired. I'm finding I'm honoring my needs a lot more. So if I just want to sit around in sweats that one day and I don't have a lot of responsibilities, then I'm going to feel okay with that, when before I felt like I had to dress up and be presentable all the time and meet these criteria that someone put on me. But the shame piece is interesting because, first of all, anyone in this position didn't get there alone. There's a lot of things that go into developing an addiction or an eating disorder, because I do consider them very similar. For me, it was a lot of my childhood background that contributed to the stressors that I was trying to deal with. And for me, the way to control my life was through controlling my shape. And over exercising for the endorphins I felt like I needed because it made me feel good. So it was, in a sense, a self-medication to something. So it's all about control. Eating disorders are. It's not about food. So when you look at that, what went into causing the situation where you needed to feel like you had to have control? There's so much that goes into that for each individual. But for me, it was about controlling my environment. So the shame in that I used to bear, but now I look at it and I say, you know what? That happened. It's no one's fault. It just is the way it was.
Yeah.
But I should not be ashamed that I dealt with that. It was just part of my life. So there's no shame involved in getting to where you are. And how you got there is how you got there. So that I had to let go right away. I couldn't blame my parents. I couldn't blame anybody. It was my work to do, and it was me. So there was more of a sense of responsibility after that. But I would say freedom is the number one thing that's come out of it for me. Freedom of choice. I don't feel like I have to do things a certain way or be a certain way or look a certain way. I can just be me. And freedom in my brain. And that was the biggest for me because I wanted that space to create. and be present for my family and be a better wife and a better parent and a better everything. So instead of obsessively going through the things I would go through during a day of being worried about the stuff I was worried about, that was all gone.
Mm-hmm. During the break, you mentioned that now that you've been in recovery, you now have the energy to be able to try all these new things and really commit to your art, and it's exploded basically across the page or across the canvas. And seeing that, have you found that your work even has flourished from this?
Yes, that's a good question. I think the connection to self has definitely created, for lack of a better word, a better connection to my own way of painting and my own strokes, everything about it, like gesturally, down to color choice, down to just being motivated to do it, like actually having that creative muse show up for me now was something I could never conjure up. In the last 25 years, I can't think of a time where I could actually feel like I had enough energy to go out and paint or think of something to paint.
Yeah, well, you were saying earlier that like now there's so much free brain space because you weren't going through the checklists anymore. So it allows you almost to have more space in your mind to be more creative.
Yes.
And probably making it so that it's flowing so fast that you can't keep up.
That is it's a nice problem to have, but it is a problem.
Yeah.
And it's like, do more what you love and it'll just keep coming, and that's really what's happening.
And I love that you said that you feel more authentically you and it's able to transpire in your artwork. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
That's the gift. That's the real gift. And I would want that for anybody midlife, is to just relax, and you are where you are, and that is good enough. And it's this good enoughness that I struggled with, that now I feel like I don't need to reach for that anymore. I just know it now.
Yeah. We're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about some of the tips that Robin has come to find in dealing with EDs, and we will be right back just after a quick break. Welcome back. I wanted to ask you, Robin, now that you are on this side of your story, and now that you have had some time to be able to look back, what would you say, why would you say that you feel that it went undetected, your ED went undetected for 35 years? And is there a similarity between why it would go undetected in youth or in, what's the word that I'm looking for? Oh my God. Adolescence, thank you.
Good question. And I'm glad I am able to be on this side to have that perception. I feel lucky and I feel thankful. So looking back and connecting some dots, I see why it happened, and I could understand my motivations, but because it's so invisible to a lot of people, it is perceived as perception or motivation or perfectionism. It can oftentimes go undetected physically and biologically and physiologically, because on paper, most people with eating disorders look fantastic. They are hitting numbers that you would most likely say are good numbers. So it's often hard to go to a regular doctor's appointment and have someone pick up on this. I even went through personally different sets of GI doctors who still did not pick it up with multiple diagnostic tests and things. So it's very easy to go missing through the cracks on this at any age. And I say that because even pediatricians, most doctors don't get a tremendous amount of training about eating disorders. It's a specialized profession. So unless you're seeing a specialized person for it, it will most likely not be picked up on.
Do you think that it's almost like something that you have to self-diagnose? So like you have to realize, oh, these are issues that I'm dealing with, and you have to bring it to the attention of your medical professional. Like you mentioned that your daughter, like her friends were concerned, and they said, hey, we need you to talk to your mom about this, or we think that you need some help. And in turn, you were in therapy with her, and you read and realized, oh my gosh, I think that this is something that's affecting me as well. Is it something that we almost, and maybe that's why it goes undetected, because doctors don't want to say, hey, you have an eating disorder. Do you think that it's maybe like waiting for you to realize it yourself, or?
That's a good question. I think there's, unfortunately, a lot of self-diagnosis that might come from outside of yourself. People noticing things. Thank God people paying attention to certain things, behaviors that contribute to it. But again, because there are atypical situations, you can't really read the book by its cover. So I think you're right. There is a lot of coming to terms with it on your own, and that's unfortunate because most people don't even like me, I did not realize I even had a problem. So unfortunately, things start to break down, and that's when people start asking questions. And that can happen at any age.
From your experience, why do you think that some people develop an ED later in life?
There are so many variables and reasons why people choose eating disorders as a coping mechanism. Some of it, maybe, and this is just my experience, I feel like as a midlife woman, the expectations on the outside world, whether it be how you're supposed to look, how you're supposed to act, and how you're supposed to be after having children or not having children, or being at this place in your life with your career, whatever, there's all these expectations. I feel like some of that pressure might lend itself to trying to control one's environment, trying to control anything in one's life at that point. And so eating disorder behavior becomes an easy thing to fall into. Over-exercising, clean eating. And on top of that, the images that we are given every day of what we're supposed to look like too, whether it be social media or through any kind of media, exacerbate that problem, needing to look a certain way, things like that. So I think it's really easy for someone in midlife to fall into some kind of disordered patterns.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with trying to figure out your identity as well, right?
Yes.
You're moving from a stage, we were talking about during the break, of being a mom, and then maybe with the kids leaving the house, and now you have to go into this new space, or not being a mom, and now you are a mom and having to navigate this new space. So changes to your body, changes to your hormones, changes to your profession even, like, and having to keep up with a job, and as you said, having to look or perform a certain way. Some of the pressure that women have just makes them feel like they need a way to cope. And as you said, this is the one thing that they can control. It makes it so that they have a space where they feel in charge of something.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Unfortunately, identifying yourself at 50 and identifying yourself as an adolescent are very similar. Unfortunately, there's a lot of an identity crisis going on. And whether it be the need to fit in or to conform to standards, I think they're very similar.
Yeah.
So struggling at 14 and struggling at 50 are two different things. Of course, you have more skills at 50, but they both have similarities of why someone might fall into this pattern.
Yeah, like keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak. Yeah. And I think, personally, I think that social media has a lot to do with the pressures that so many people feel, because you'll see the highlight reels of people's lives where they can be the Pinterest mom and look at me bringing, free range gluten-free cupcakes to my kids at school that are decorated with royal ice, and I churned my own butter, whatever it is. And then you have like the kids who are like also validating their worth by likes or comments on their social media feeds. So all of us feeling like we have to show up a certain way for other people, it's highly anxiety provoking.
Yes.
If you know,
and dangerous.
Very dangerous. Very
Yeah,
dangerous.
I agree. I don't like having to fit into those standards anymore. So I feel like we all come to a place, hopefully, that we can say that. But when you're a young person, I don't feel like you have that choice yet. You don't have that wisdom. So they are more susceptible, for sure, to those standards put on them. But I'm just glad that I've been able to conjure up feelings of adequacy, and I think I've got pole position and lots of mileage on kids that are 14, 15, 16, even 20s. So I have a little more skill, thank God, to get through something like this. So I can't imagine really being aware of an eating disorder at a young age. But I think you'd asked me my perspective looking back and being in this position now, what I can see. And I think what I was doing, which is what most adolescents do, so in a way I was very immature, was trying to keep up with an image or a status or standards that were placed on me by who knows where they came from. But that the idea of just letting all of that go and owning my own stuff and being happy with who I am is just a gift, and that's the way I look at it now. And I would just hope that people would feel at this point in their life, eating disorder or not, that they can invest in themselves and get rid of the fear of having to meet those standards and really just own who they are at this time in life. And that's a message that needs to be blasted for people in midlife, I think, really.
Well, I think self-acceptance is just something that we don't get enough training on because you see it almost everywhere, that we're constantly pitted against each other instead of saying like, oh, look, we can just be accepted exactly as we are, loved exactly where we're at. We were talking actually during the break about being able to love people through very difficult experiences. And one of the other things that you brought up was some of the statistics that were happening around EDs. And would you mind sharing some of those statistics with us?
Sure. There's a heaviness to eating disorders, and unfortunately the statistics are very negative. At this time, currently, what I pulled off the National Eating Disorder Association's website is about the mortality rates of people with eating disorders. And unfortunately, in the world of eating disorders, the mortality rates statistics are really negative. And I'm going off current numbers from the National Eating Disorder Association's website. And they are startling. And part of the reason why I'm doing this is to bring awareness to the fact how dangerous eating disorders are. My daughter is trying to do that in her life's work now. And we both feel that it's just under-communicated, it's underdeveloped education, and more now than ever, I think, after a pandemic of high anxiety and stress, people need to understand how dangerous it is. So just to give you some, my top 3 statistics that I think are the most extraordinary are that EDs have the highest mortality rate of all mental illness across the board, nationwide, worldwide. The mortality rate of anorexic, in particular, anorexics, is 12 times higher than the death rate of all causes of deaths for females between 15 and 24 years old. So 12 times, not 12%. And that got me really hard, because that means that's the thing people are dying most of or from at that age group, and that's terrible. Without treatment, 20% of those individuals die, and the deaths are unfortunately usually from suicide or cardiac arrest. And most people don't understand that eating disorders affect the body organs so terribly, and mainly the heart, that a lot of the times 1/3 of all deaths from eating disorders are cardiac problems, either with the bradycardia, the hypotension, or the arrhythmias, excuse me. So there are a lot of dangers to eating disorders that are undisclosed in typical everyday media. And it's important that, I think more importantly, for young people to understand those statistics.
That's beautiful that your daughter has committed her life's work and her organization. The name of her organization?
The Fight Behind Our Forks.
And the focus of their organization is educating the youth. Is that correct? And so if anyone wanted more information about her organization, we're going to put up a slide at the end of this, complete with a ton of different resources that Robin has found very, very useful. And one of the things that I wanted to ask, I guess one final question would be, you're in a very unique position because not only are you able to speak from firsthand experience, you're also able to speak from someone who is supporting someone going through this same experience. What would you tell someone who is suspecting that maybe there is an issue or there is a possibility of an ED?
First and foremost, self-detection, like I said, is difficult. So I would go to the National Eating Disorders Association's website, which you will disclose later. And there are several questionnaires there. There's education and data that would help someone maybe get an idea if there was this problem with a loved one. So that is first and foremost. And then secondly, I would advise seeking out in the community a specific specialist that can help detect eating disorders, and that would be an eating disorder medical professional. Most of the times, like I said, regular doctors are going to miss it because everything looks great on paper. So the professionals that do this for a living look for very specific things, and they can really help detect it. And that's, frankly, I did that the day after my daughter told me, and thank God we did, because 3 days later she was in a very critical position in the hospital. So it's important to act as soon as you can.
Robin, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on today. And actually, I have something for you. On behalf of Soul Loved, I wanted to give you this bracelet. This bracelet is actually called Victory. And it's actually a bracelet that helps fight after addictions or fight addictions or addictive tendencies. So the mantra for this one is, I am in control. I am the co-creator of my own destiny. I am victorious. And one of the things that a lot of people who have been in recovery from any kind of addiction, they mention that they just get in their own head. And so one of the things that this bracelet does is it helps not only the healing energies of the amethyst, but it has hematite in there to help keep you grounded so that we don't feel so flustered and in our head. And then there's also the stone of joy, which is the crazy lace agate, and it allows us to feel that joy and that connection to our peace and that in that aspect. And then finally, there's also a rose quartz on here, which is healing that space of love and allowing yourself to not only feel love for yourself, but to allow it to blossom in the rest of your life. So I wanted to give this to you.
I will wear it diligently.
Yeah,
I could use all of these.
Yeah, and it has the North Star on there, and as the final touch. And the North Star is to help guide you to your destination, so that you know where you're going and where you're coming from. So I hope that is a trinket that you'll enjoy.
I will. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a very heavy topic, and thank you so much for sharing your light with us, Robin. And when we come back in our next following episodes, I look forward to definitely seeing you again soon. Thank you for joining us, and take care. Cheers.